The question of who created esports and when is one that is naturally gonna come up many times, and unfortunately most of the people who are going to attempt an answer at it or try and intuit what the possible root cause could be, and therefore the factors which caused it to come into being, tend to be unqualified to actually go ahead and do so. There hasn't been a comprehensive history of the game written in terms of, well, not the game, the scene and the community and the phenomenon written from the very beginning. People have attempted certain versions, but then they always go different places. Some people go as far back as like Pong and arcade tournaments in the 70s and 80s. Some people start with computer games like FPS games in the 90s. Some people start in the 2000s. And one of the recurring trends I've seen, which comes out of the RTS community, and particularly people who are familiar with Korean esports and the phenomenon that esports have been over in that particular country of South Korea, is they will say, oh, Korea created esports, Korea invented esports, Korea made esports big. Or sometimes they even go further than that and they attach themselves to Boxer, probably the most iconic figure from Korean esports, at least until the days of Faker, and they'll say, oh, it's actually Boxer. Boxer practically created esports, or he made esports big, or he developed esports in terms of the impact that his career had. Now, the problem with this is, it is on many levels just factually inaccurate. Like, it's even chronologically, it doesn't match up. I mean, to contrast to Boxer, I would just say this. Thresh, the first huge name in the Western esports scene and champion, was someone who had won $21,000 in prize money, a supercharged Ferrari, and had travelled internationally, all before there even was an on-GameNet Star League, which is the tournament that Boxer won famously to propel his name to the stratosphere, and Boxer didn't even win the first OSL, he won the third OSL. So 3 years before Boxer ever won an OSL, Thresh had done all these things. Won prize money, won a Ferrari, and had travelled internationally, and had gained some level of fame in the West, and had sponsorship. So pinpointing who started it and who created esports and when, it's not simple. I mean, first and foremost, because the term didn't even exist back then. It was called competitive gaming, or it was called Quake, or it was called StarCraft, or whatever else. It didn't have the term esports, so we can't chart where esports first came in as a term. Secondly, it was a grassroots movement. People putting on tournaments at which you could play these competitive multiplayer games is essentially, I mean, in the most vague and abstract sense, that's essentially the beginning of esports. Prize money, that came later. Sponsorships for players and for tournaments, that came later. People having big names as players, and therefore the expectation that they will go to a specific tournament, and therefore there is prestige around that tournament because it's got the best players there. International competition, people who are the best from other countries coming, playing the best from the country in question, the host nation. These things all came later, after the prize money, after the sponsors, after the grassroots movement, after the games first got popular. See, to really decide who created esports, we've got to pick some criteria, and then we've got to look what fits into that. So, okay, here's one aspect of criteria you could go with. Because if we just look at whoever held tournaments with no prize money and that you could just play at, yes, those go back to the arcade days. Yes, those go back to the very first LAN parties for games like Quake. So we're talking, and even Doom before that. So we'd be talking about the mid-90s, sort of like 94, 95. If we're talking about Quake, we're talking about 96, 97, talking about launch events, talking about LAN parties. But that's not really esports in anything comparable to the modern sense, because there's nothing to be won. There's just the bragging rights, that's it, and it's just in one location, and nobody really travels to that place. So we've got to start putting some criteria down. So one aspect of criteria, especially chronologically, that we could put in initially, is let's have tournaments where you win merchandise or prizes of some note. It can't just be you win a mouse, or you win free time at the LAN cafe, because again, those are going to be incredibly early. We can't even chart those, and they're of really, if we're talking about the spirit of what we're discussing here, they're of no relevance. So okay, one of the first instances we can find is in 1997 in June. There was a tournament called Red Annihilation at E3, the Electronic I can't remember what it's called, like Electronic something Expo in, I think it's in LA, isn't it? Or is it? Yeah, I think it's in LA. It's in California, at least, I'm fairly sure. And at this tournament, Thresh, the name aforementioned, who was for a time the Michael Jordan of esports or competitive gaming at the time, he famously won this competition And the first prize was John Carmack, programmer of Doom, Quake, etc. It was his turbocharged 1987 Ferrari 328 GTS. So a fantastic vehicle, and Thresh won this as his prize. Then we have other tournaments. So a couple of months later, it was in October of 1997, the CPL, the Cyber Athlete Professional League, which would go on to be a big player for, we're talking about the next decade within esports, ran one of their first events. It was called The Frag, and it was in Dallas, Texas, and it was won by a player called Gollum, who would feature in a bunch of the early Quake 1 and CPL tournaments. And in winning this tournament, he won merchandise worth $1,000. So, I mean, I'd have to speculate without knowing specifically, probably computer parts, probably a computer. Then we had other tournaments, as I mentioned, that were going on. So, for example, QuakeCon, in the Quake context, in the last decade, has been a notable esports event with prize money and big players go there. But actually, even to the modern day, it wasn't until the last few years that QuakeCon made a professional tournament, made it so that there was an invite component, or that these spots are located for people who are professionals. Even when Quake 3 was in its heyday initially, in 2002, you still had to go if you were at QuakeCon, and you were just, even if you were a pro wanting to compete in the main tournament, and there's prize money, you were essentially a pleb like everyone else. You went there, you had to sign up to the tournament, and the first X number of players, let's say 128, 256, were selected for the tournament, and if you were a pro player and you hadn't got your name on there, you just didn't get in. Like, there was a year when Fatality got into a competition, purely because he didn't sign up in time, and someone else, or they did like a little lottery to see who got in, and then someone, he just said, oh, I'll wait and see if someone doesn't turn up. Someone didn't turn up, and he got to play in the tournament. So that's not really a professional tournament in the context of esports. And actually, the early Quake cons, you didn't win anything. It was just a big LAN. It's a LAN that's put on by id Software for the community, for Quakers, for people who play Doom, sure, but they weren't serious, and they weren't really in the spirit of esports. So, okay, let's expand the criteria further. Let's say tournaments that aren't just with prizes in terms of merchandise that can be won. It's got to be tournaments where, you know, let's say the ones that if you qualify for the LAN, you get your travel paid to attend the LAN. That sounds professional, right? That sounds like competitive esports in some kind of a meaningful sense, contrasted against sports or what modern esports are. Okay, so in, again, 1997, we're moving on through the year. In November of that year, there was a tournament called Clan Ring Tournament 3. It was the third edition of a Quake. I mean, in this case, it was Quake 1, because we're talking about NetQuake, which is the one that North Americans played. But at the time, I mean, Europeans, as soon as it came out, started to play Quake. I think that was 98, though. So this tournament was a Quake tournament, and it flew the finalists to Los Angeles, to a place called Slam Site, to battle against each other. It was a team deathmatch, TDM, 4v4 competition, and Death Row, Thresh's clan, won the tournament. And so that's a pretty interesting step up, getting flown to a location to play on LAN against each other, not just playing online or just from a LAN cafe with a small group of people. So let's expand further. Obviously, a key component to modern esports is you got to win money, right? You got to win actual hard cash that isn't just merchandise worth that much, and therefore the person giving it to you didn't have to pay as much for it. It's not worth as much to them. It's only worth that to you if you paid full retail value. We're talking about if someone gives you $1,000 that you won in prize money, you can take that $1,000 and you can go spend it anywhere in the world for whatever $1,000 buys you. That's a step up. That's moving towards professionalism beyond just a competitive area and something that people are dedicated at, but something you can start to make money from. You can actually earn a living from to whatever degree. So one of the first tournaments was the PGL, the professional, I think it was the Professional Gaming League, something along those lines. And this one, the first one was in 1998, the offline final. It was in the 31st of January, and season 1 final was in Seattle, Washington, and it was won by Thresh, the aforementioned name. He was beaten in the upper bracket by Reptile, someone who would go on to be his clanmate in Death Row, and then Thresh came from the lower bracket, beat Reptile in the final, and won the tournament. And he won $7,500 for first place. Now, $7,500 for one tournament is still pretty legit now. That's nothing to sniff at. And back then in 1998, that's big money. That's pretty respectable. We're starting to see esports going somewhere. That's not like winning merchandise worth $1,000 in the past. Then the very same year, 6 months later, in July the 23rd, we had the first CPL event where you could win money. We had an event called the CPL event, and it was in Dallas, Texas, as most of their events were. It was won by a player called Rix, who in the early days of Quake 1 and in the very, very early days of Quake 3 was a known figure and was competing and was a good player. And he won $3,000. Again, pretty good figure. Now, yeah, there was no Thresh. People didn't fly internationally at that point in time. And obviously, Thresh wasn't an international player, but he was on the West Coast, and this was in central area. It was in Texas. It was in Dallas. And there wasn't the same kind of people coming in, but it was a tournament that within Dallas was big, had big prize money, and obviously that's worth noting in as much as the PGL only lasted a few seasons and then died out as a big league, even though it was getting a lot of press, etc. Whereas the CPL, this was a league that continued on for many years and switched to Counter-Strike and did Quake and did Doom, all these other games that they could do at different points in time. Actually, I don't think they did Doom, did they? Did they have a tournament in Doom? I forget actually for that. They did Painkiller, obviously. So how about we add in tournaments that have international appeal, like truly good players from different countries competing internationally, and then as a result, international press coverage? Well, one of the most famous ones, again, moving forwards in time, was in 1998, just before the CPL event, in the same month, July, on the 8th of July, there was the Death Row versus Clan 9 exhibition match. And what happened was, Clan 9 was the best European Quake World Team Deathmatch team. Death Row was the best North American Net Quake. So Quake World was a mod, a different way to play Quake. A client you could play it through that had different netcode and as a result had different effect on the physics, for example. Net Quake was original Quake, basically out of the box, just played online with the latest patches. And Death Row was the best North American Quake team. As I pointed out, they won Clan Ring tournament, etc. And so Death Row, a sponsor was found to fly them over to Stockholm, Sweden, the home of Clan 9, the Swedish team, and they would go to 9 Studios, or it might have been Cafe 9 at the time. That was the sponsor of Cloud 9, and it was one of the most famous of all time net cafes in Sweden. And they played there in an exhibition tournament. Now, here's the problem. It wasn't as great a game in as much as the Death Row guys had already moved on to Quake 2 at this point in time. Clan 9 was still in Quake World, which Quake 2 hadn't taken as much of a hold in European esports. And you've got to add in, not only the guys from Death Row not played Quake in quite a while, at least seriously as a proper team, but also they played NetQuake, and as I said, Quake World's different. So to try and make it fair, they made it so the exhibition would have 5 NetQuake games and 5 Quake World games, but it didn't matter ultimately. Clan 9 ended up winning 8-1. I mean, I don't know what happened to the last game. I think they just quit at that point in time. They absolutely dominated it, and actually it was very much an exhibition in as much as you could see the Death Row guys didn't know how Quake World operated. They didn't know some of the jumps you could do with the air acceleration, and they didn't know the modern meta of how to play Quake World. Like, they didn't understand that they had what I mean, funnily, if it's their own term, the CES style, where you just constantly attacked even with the lowest weapons, but en masse and as a unit, and that's how you got control of weapons back. Whereas they played the old control style. Funnily enough, in later versions of Quake Team Deathmatch, you could go between these styles. But they played the control style where you just stick together, you try and get a gun together, you try and use that gun together, you try and get more guns, and you try and control in that particular sense. So it was a clash of ideologies, and the European one won out in that sense. So it was. Then you got to add in more criteria, right? How about we have international appeal, press attention, and it was actually something where it's a truly international competition, like a first attempt at something approximating a world championship. Because the problem with the Death Row Clan 9 one was there was no prize money on the line. It had all the international flavour and all the rest of it. So, okay, let's go and add in a world championship element where the person winning this might be the best at their game. Well, in 1999, in March, there was a tournament called the True Gamers International. It took place also at a net cafe in Sweden. It took place at a place called Janneman's ET Palats. And I know this. I actually worked for a company that guy owned at one point in time, Gamers that New Year's later. And it was organized by the famous Isno. And this was in Gothenburg, Sweden. And they brought in the best European Quake World players. They brought in the best player from Australia. They brought in some players from North America, but admittedly people like Thresh had long moved on. So the best from North America, some of them turned it down, etc. It didn't manage to get necessarily all the best players, but it had a truly international feel. It was very competitive. And the winner of this tournament, it was kind of the end of the big period in esports for Quake World, was Lakerman. Another figure who went on for years and years to be considered one of the elite players and always a top competitor. And he beat a player called Kane from Germany in the final, a young guy. And this is a tournament that had international flavour. Now, it didn't have prize money. So, okay, let's add in all the details together, right? Let's add all the context that a modern tournament could have and see when that first happened. So we're talking about big prize money, not just prize money for the winner, big prize money for the whole tournament and for the winner, and a world championship type feel, so it feels like the best players are all there, and some kind of a qualification system, so people play smaller tournaments like LANs and then qualify to go there, have airfare paid, etc., have the early sponsorships for players for the actual tournament. So one of the first ones to match all this criteria would actually be the Razer CPL. This was a CPL event sponsored by Razer, and it was in Dallas, Texas again, and it took place in April of 2000, and it had a $100,000 purse for the entire tournament. Something like 800 people attended. It was won by Fatality, another name who would go on to big fame, and still to this day is relevant in esports, and his first place prize was $40,000, which again, in modern day one-on-one sports, that's still one-on-one esports. That's still a big amount of money for one person to win in a one-on-one sport. Now, all of that took place in the West. All of the criteria that we need for everything to fit what modern day esports is, to some degree, it's all happened in the West, right? So you might think, well, what about Korea, Thorin? Where's Korea? They told me Korea invented esports. Let's go over to Korea, shall we? So Korea had some smaller tournaments and some kind of invitational tournaments, etc., in sort of like 1999, around this type of period, late 1998. They weren't as big. They didn't have pro gamers in the same sense. They didn't have the same TV coverage. They didn't have the international flavor. They had maybe the odd player came over. So the OSL, the On GameNet Star League, On GameNet being a TV channel, that only actually got going in the year 2000, early in the year 2000. Now, there was a precursor tournament to that. It was called Tooniverse Pro Gamer Career Open. It was the precursor to the OSL. It was won by a player called Freemura, a Zerg player. And that's where essentially the OSL started to get its roots. Now, the first actual OSL was in February of 2000, and it was won by a foreigner. It was not won by a Korean. It was won by the French-Canadian, that's how you pronounce his name, Guillaume Patry, guy I've done interviews with. I've done an interview with in the past about his career. It wasn't the same kind of scale. It wasn't the same kind of interest. It was the first, burgeoning attempt at esports over there. And it wasn't until 2001 that Boxer came along and actually won an OSL. He started playing in some of the early ones. So there's another tournament in Korea that we have to highlight, because another thing people often say is, right, since Korea kickstarted esports, World Cyber Games was a big part of it, right? The first official World Cyber Games was World Cyber Games 2001. So we already know 2001 is far past Razer CPL, True Gamers International, Death Row versus Clan 9, the CPL event, PGL, Red Annihilation, Clan Ring Tournament. We got to go way back. So, okay, before the World Cyber Games, they had a tournament called the World Cyber Games Challenge, which is almost like the pilot, And this was in Seoul, South Korea, took place in October of 2000, and you could win prize money, and there was a lot of big tournaments for Quake and for StarCraft, and international players went. The problem is, though, that how the players went was very interesting. It wasn't the same kind of a qualification system that later years would be. Whether all the best players were there was more questionable. This is years and years after comparable aspects of what was going on. This was on a bigger scale because it was funded by Samsung eventually, was going on. But this is years after the fact of the West. And this is one where, famously, Fatality actually won the Quake 3 tournament here, beat Lakerman in the final, and GoRush, who would later go on to win an MSL years later, and was one of the better Zerg players for a number of years in the early 2000s, won the Brood War tournament. Now, what about Boxer? Okay, so Boxer won the third and fourth OSLs. Now, the third OSL, the one that he won, his first, began in February of 2001. So we can already see esports, even in Korea, is already going by that point in time. Already has TV channels showing it, already has interest from fans. Esports in the West has developed entirely parallel, has already begun, has spread around the world, has all the different components at different times as you go in chronology forwards, and has absolutely developed on its own before a fella called Boxer ever won anything of note. So Boxer's impact in Korea, and this is the key detail, not in the world, because he had very little impact in the world until fairly recently. Boxer's impact in Korea was comparable to Michael Jordan's impact in the NBA. The NBA already existed. The NBA had some niche following. The NBA had a business behind it. But what happened was he wasn't just the best player. Boxer was at the time, just as Michael Jordan was at the time he was playing, but he drew in more fans. That's the key part there. He was by virtue of how exciting his play was and charismatic he was, that's what drew in a lot of extra fans and helped blow the game up a bit. So in that sense, just as Michael Jordan didn't create the NBA and didn't create even the modern NBA necessarily, it could have certainly got to these same places, maybe it would have taken longer. Michael Jordan was a catalyst to the NBA getting bigger and more international. Boxer was a catalyst to Brood War getting bigger in Korea. Now, international appeal, okay, fans in the West, very, very small amount of people, you have to consider back in the early 2000s, yeah, wanted to see Boxer play at World Cyber Games and all the rest of it. but they didn't see him playing big competitions internationally. He didn't go to the West at all. Brood War didn't really have a Western scene beyond a very, very niche scene, in contrast to Quake and Counter-Strike and the other big games in Warcraft 3 in the West, which were much, much bigger esports games and a much more developed scene. So these things were developing in parallel, and Boxer was very much a big fish in a small pond in that sense. It wasn't until games like StarCraft 2 that we started to see him in the West, and we started to see more crossover, because guess what? StarCraft 2 was a big game in the West. Ironically, didn't end up really being one in Korea, but that's, as a result, how it wasn't just the legend of Boxer then. We got to actually see him come to these events. We got to see him play. We got to see all these aspects of him. And people got to hear the story more so, because there was more people to hear the story. So Korea developed entirely in parallel and with little to no overlap whatsoever. In fact, there's no causal effect from almost anything that happened in Korean esports when it got going, despite how big it did get at one point in time in the mid-2000s, that affected Western esports and made that grow bigger, or influenced how it grew, or helped it grow in any way, or caused it to grow. There is none. And in fact, esports developed initially in the West before Korea, and in many other aspects, which if I showed you only Korean esports and you only knew about Korean esports, you'd think they invented all those components of professionalism and having pro gamers and sponsors for the tournament and having players win prize money and get flown into places. No, all these things have already existed in the West. Now, Korea took the baton to some degree, and in some respects took things further. Players in Korea in sort of 2007, 2008, could make $200,000, $300,000 a year, like unheard of amounts in the West. Players could be in a situation where they had everything paid for them, they had the best conditions, they had full coaches, all the rest of it, they were on television. These are all factors where they got ahead once they got going, but they didn't create it. Now, Korea's growth, the reason why it is in no way causal to the West, is because it's down to entirely different factors even. As I said, the Western esports scene grew completely out of a grassroots effort of small tournaments, and the fact that Quake was the initial big game that everyone played, and then the obsessive nature of how hardcore people were into Quake, that they wanted to see these, and they wanted to watch demos, and they wanted to try and compete against each other, and then see who's the best in a region, and who's the best in a country, and who's the best in a continent, and who's the best in the world, and then add in prize money and sponsors and all these factors. Now, what made esports grow and Brood War grow over in Korea is it wasn't just esports, it was Brood War that grew. What happened was Brood War became a phenomenon. It became a popular pop culture fad in Korea. Now that's can't be understated. Now, there's a lot of factors go into that. The state of the economy in the early to mid-90s and what that bred beyond that. The fact that as a result, people looked for cheap entertainment. The fact that as a society, people wanted their kids to work very hard and be very diligent at school. So therefore, to slack off, to procrastinate, you told your mum you were going to the library, you got $5 from her, the equivalent, and then you went over to the LAN cafe and you got 4 or 5 hours out of that, and you had a snack while you were playing, and you just played these games that were cheap. Remember, Brood War, by the time you get into the 2000s, has been out for many years, can run on practically any PC, and it's already installed on the machine where you come there. You don't have to buy the game as well. So it's very cheap entertainment. There's the post-Korean War tech growth, which we've seen. It starts out and then it eventually has a spike in the late 90s, and they become a fantastically technological country, which obviously helps with the internet being amazing there, and LAN cafes everywhere, and the technological components that actually in some senses took them ahead of the West in some of those regards. I remember what it was like with the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s in the UK. It was a fucking joke. I was on a 56k modem in the days where people in Korea were already on like practically fiber optics basically. Then you've got to consider that there's the fact that it all took place within Seoul. In the West, all these tournaments are taking place over countries. They're taking place over continents. In Korea, it's just all in Seoul. It's not even about Korea. It's not about Korean esports. It's about one game being played obsessively in Seoul, where there are tons and tons of internet cafes and amazing internet routing between itself. Obviously, an extremely unique one-off exception. And as a result, none of the factors that made it grow there made it grow in the West. You've got to look at the fact that Koreans have an obsessive culture. They're all very interested in what the latest trend is, and they want to be a part of it, and they want to be doing it now. And if their friends are doing it, they want to be doing it, and they want to be competing against their friends. They want to be talking about it. And while these things are very hot, they get incredibly hot, and everyone's into it. And then when they lose interest, it fades away, and people lose interest in general. There's not the same smooth growth. It's a really an up and down sort of thing. And that's why, as big as Brood War was at the end, it had already jumped the shark. It jumped the shark from like 2005, 2006 when it had the huge numbers, when that famous picture exists where it looks like there's like 100,000 people in the crowd. I don't know. I don't believe there's that many, but a massive amount of people watching one of the finals. then you've got to consider that the unique nature of how Korean society is structured in terms of business with the chaebols, these family-run businesses, which then themselves can own 4 or 5 businesses below, which can own businesses below. And as a result, essentially means you have these ridiculous almost pseudo monopolies, especially when the chaebols, like Game of Thrones style houses, align with each other and intermarry. You have this ridiculous kind of monopoly structure that makes society incredibly stratified. So it's not the case that a land center company in the West is running a tournament and then they get involved with a sponsor, and then there's a disconnect between how they would get more sponsorship, how they would get to an international level, how they would get press attention, and how they would get actually to a point where they could be on TV. There's a massive lot of disconnects, and a lot of hurdles have to be leapt and overcome by the diligent people who worked for a decade in Western esports to get it to that level where it ever had a chance to be on TV or to have these massive sponsorships and to do a lot of the things that in Korea could be taken for granted. Because when, as a pop culture phenomenon, Brood War broke out like this, the chaebol structure actually meant that you could have TV stations who early on were taking a chance publishing gaming content and then publishing Brood War as well, and realized this is cheap entertainment to create and people are into it and it has a cult following, and so very quickly it could get ahead in that respect. And Korea for many years in the 2000s was ahead of the West in terms of esports, in terms of development and technology and evolution essentially. Now, funnily enough, Korea hasn't kept the pace with the West. It's still got all those same factors in place, and yet we hear these stories that up until a few years ago, Western League of Legends pros earned more than the best Korean League of Legends pros. How's that possible when they have massive tech companies sponsoring them in Korea? I mean, how could a game in the West that isn't even on TV, doesn't have any pop culture appeal, just has very minimal overlap into the mainstream and is a popular game, how could that generate more money, more income, a better ecosystem than over in Korea? Another component to the success of esports in Korea as well that I feel like requires a very nuanced understanding of Korean culture as it relates to esports and is never spoken about is that one area that they had a fantastic level of success with esports in Korea was with young people. And it's specifically young teenagers, like 12 to 15-year-olds, people who essentially are in secondary school or high school, depending on which country you're from. These are the people who the fad really caught on with in Korea. And as such, one thing that's really overblown is the notion that the entire nation of South Korea loved Brood War and was super interested in it, and all the adults watched it, and your dad watched it, and your congressman watched it, and your local shopkeeper watched it. They didn't. And they weren't interested in this particular sense. And in that sense, it wasn't the Korean national sport. Whenever I've spoken, and obviously I've spent more than a year living in Korea, and I've known many Korean people. I've known people who were Korean immigrants to America who've gone back to Korea, and so have a fantastic opportunity to bridge the gap and really give a contrast of the sports between. They've told me time and time again, yes, people who are young teenagers know about esports, or people played it when they were. And in fact, that's something famously that they'll say. They'll be like, oh, esports, oh, Brood War. Yeah, that's something I used to do when I was 12 years old. That's something I used to do when I was 15. That's why you'll get a lot of people who do know Boxer's name, and they'll say stuff like, oh, Boxer is the #1 player. And you go, you know, he hasn't played in like about half a decade. And that actually, he, you know, basically wasn't the best player in Brood War since about like 2002. And they'll be like, oh, really? I mean, there's even examples where people in Korean culture have asked, like Monte Cristo, the guy who's an English language League of Legends caster, the biggest game there at the moment, like, oh, how's Guillaume Patry doing? The guy where I told you he won the tournament in 2000 and has been retired for like 15 years almost. So the idea is like they don't know, the adults don't really know that much about esports. They don't follow it. It's just that they caught on so well with that one demographic. And so that's another area in which Korea is ahead of the West. It's not like every teenager in the West to this day knows about esports. But one area that I think the West has also outpaced Korea with is the idea that the actual average age base, I would go ahead and guess, in the West is higher. I think there's more people who are 23 years old who watch esports in the West. I've been to all those Korean games. That's another factor. Korea doesn't have many events where they are able to pack in thousands of people to watch. Most of those events, like OSL games, the group stage games, or Pro League games, or go and watch LCK now, the biggest League of Legends competition. And what you get is you get a studio that has at most, let's say 200 or 300 people watching the game each week. Now, for the big finals, they can get like 10,000. They don't get that many instances where in modern day Korea, where it's like some of the esports events we've had in the West, where you have a massive stadium packed full of people and where you can have that 10 times a year. They might have it 2 or 3 times a year. And so again, the West in some respects has developed differently and has actually in some aspects outpaced Korea. It's not the same scenario that like Korea was the best immediately, they created esports and it's been the best ever since. Nonsense. This is not the case. So it's a very difficult, a very nuanced question to answer who created esports. And ultimately, you'll never come to one answer. You'll have to decide your criteria and then pick your answer from there. Because you can go all the way back, and if you take away criteria, I can keep going back and back and back, and we can go back years, decades, and we can if we go abstract enough, we can go even more than that, a couple of decades. So it's a very difficult question to answer. Most people speaking out on this topic are not qualified to speak out on it, don't know what they're talking about, don't have any grounding, and are repeating things they have heard 11th hand. Not even like first hand, second hand. This is like a game of telephone going on between them. Chinese whispers, as we used to call it in the UK.
What up, guys? This is Jordan Gilbert.
We work with the world's top pros to teach you how to take your game to the next level with constantly updated training content. When you're done watching and want to train or warm up, just a few clicks will put you in your preferred training mods like Deathmatch. But why warm up for a match on Mirage by getting shot in the back on Dust 2? That's why we built Duels, real fights and real maps. 1 minute in Duels is like 20 rounds of real CS. Exclusively available on Boomio.com.